Production funding for this program made possible in part by a grant from the Anchorage Times, celebrating 75 years of service to Alaskans.
When the 19th century ended and the 20th century began, the quest for wealth and land was never so great. An attitude of prosperity, huge construction projects, inventions, and expansionism prevailed around the world. It was a time of giant engineering projects. The Trans-Siberian, Union Pacific, Santa Fe, and Great Northern Railroads crossed the hostile territories of Russia and North America, thus opening new lands to settlement and development. The Suez Canal linked the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, and the Panama Canal was soon to connect the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Suddenly, people could travel from Liverpool, England to New York by steamship in 6 days, and then travel nearly 3,000 miles by rail to Sacramento, California in just another week. The world was becoming smaller as we moved from horse-drawn stagecoaches to steam-driven trains. In 1896, near Dawson in the Yukon Territory, the discovery of gold brought a stampede of men and women to northwest Canada and the Alaska Territory. Miners and entrepreneurs headed north to seek their fortunes in the gold fields. Stories abounded with tales of gold and copper deposits and of extensive coal fields. These discoveries drew the interest of investors and speculators, J.P. Morgan, the Guggenheims, and a host of others. A major factor in this rush for wealth was transportation. There were few ways for the miners to get their supplies and themselves into this region. A water route from the ports of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle ran northwest to St. Michael. Travelers then transferred to riverboats that steamed up the Yukon River to Dawson. A second sea route terminated at Skagway. Then goods were hauled by mule team, dog sled, and snowshoe over the summit of Chilkoot or White Pass to Dawson. For even the most adventurous, routes into the gold field were few, time-consuming, expensive, and physically demanding. A railroad was needed to solve the problem. On May 27, 1898, construction began on the first railroad on Alaska soil. The first 20 miles of the White Pass and Yukon Railroad lay in the territory. It was the first of what would be more than 50 railroad ventures that would be proposed and promoted in the territory for Alaska. Most railroads existed only on paper, but some companies did in fact survey preliminary routes and investigated natural resources along proposed routes. During 1899, Congress passed a Homesteading Act to open up Alaska. That bill granted railroad companies land for roadbeds, terminals, timber, and gravel fill along the right-of-way. In 1903, survey work began in Seward for the Alaska Central Railway. The Alaska Central would link the ice-free waters of the Gulf of Alaska with the Yukon River and open the rich coal fields of the Matanuska Valley. Construction began in 1904. A year later, construction started on a railroad from Cordova north into the Wrangell Mountains. It was guided by the Alaska Syndicate, a group formed by the wealthy East Coast financiers J.P. Morgan and the Guggenheim brothers. This would become the Copper River and Northwestern Railway that hauled copper and silver ore from the Kennecott Mining District to Cordova. At about the same time, in the Fairbanks area, construction began on the Tanana Valley Railroad. Built from 1905 to 1907 by Falcon Joslin, the 45-mile narrow-gauge railroad would service thousands of miners working in hundreds of gold mines in the Tanana Valley. Of the many proposed, only 9 railroads were actually constructed and operated in Alaska, and for the most part, they were short-lived. Gold, coal, or fish-hauling ventures that lasted only as long as the resources they carried. In the East, political columnists began to accuse the Alaska Syndicate of attempting to create a monopoly. Why? The syndicate had acquired Northwestern Fisheries, which owned 12 of the 40 Alaskan fish canneries. Then, seeking to control ocean transportation, the syndicate bought the Northwestern Steamship and Alaska Steamship Companies. The syndicate needed coal to fuel its mines, railroads, canneries, and steamships, so it then sought to control the choicest of Alaska coal lands. Fearing exhaustion of Alaska's natural resources, President Theodore Roosevelt, in November of 1906, signed an executive order withdrawing from claim and entry all coal lands still in the public domain. The act was an attempt to reserve Alaska's future coal and oil resources for those filing for land and mineral rights under the homestead laws. Alaska for Alaskans was the platform of James Wickersham, campaigning in 1908 for Alaska's one non-voting delegate to Congress, and he was elected largely because of his anti-Guggenheim stand. He was to play a significant role in the introduction and passage of the bills that would give Alaska home rule and build the Alaska Railroad. President Taft, hearing a plea for help from Alaskans, sent Secretary of the Interior Walter Fisher to investigate the problem. Fisher's report concluded that Alaska's economic malaise was due to inadequate transportation facilities and the coal land laws. In February 1912, President Taft asked Congress for a $35 million authorization to carry out the Secretary's recommendations. Instead, Congress passed a bill creating a legislative assembly for the territory of Alaska that provided Alaska with home rule. The bill also authorized President Taft to appoint the Alaska Railroad Commission to study the question of transportation in the territory. In 1913, a report entitled Railway Routes in Alaska recommended construction of 2 rail routes from the Pacific coast to the interior. One was to go from Cordova up the Copper River Valley to the Tanana River and Fairbanks, connecting with the Bering coal fields. The other route was to run from Seward to the Matanuska coal fields up the Susitna Valley to the Kuskokwim River. In January of 1914, Alaska Delegate James Wickersham delivered a 5.5-hour speech on the floor of the House elaborating on the attributes of Alaska and arguing for the government to pass a bill that would spend $35 million to build a railroad. And on March 12th, both the House and the Senate passed the Alaska Railroad Organic Act. Newly elected President Woodrow Wilson was authorized to locate and construct a railroad in the territory of Alaska. In addition to the $35 million provided by the act, the president was to take advantage of the machinery, equipment, and materials left over from the construction of the Panama Canal and use them for construction of the Alaska Railroad. In early May, President Wilson authorized Secretary of the Interior Franklin Lane to proceed with location surveys. The president appointed the Alaskan Engineering Commission under the authority of Secretary Lane to supervise location work. 3 men were selected for the commission. W.E. Eads, the first chairman of the Alaskan Engineering Commission, was at the time chief engineer of the Northern Railroad and had 30 years' experience in planning and building railroads in the West. Lieutenant Frederick Mears of the U.S. Army had worked on the Great Northern Railroad and had done construction work on the Panama Railroad. Thomas Riggs, Jr. had served as chief surveyor on the Alaska Boundary Commission, lived in Alaska for 16 years, and had a vast knowledge of the territory. By mid-June of 1914, most of the survey parties were in the field, and main bases for supplies and equipment had been established. One at Ship Creek on the Knik arm of Cook Inlet, and the other in Fairbanks. In February of 1915, the Commission submitted its report to President Wilson with no recommendation as to which route should be taken. The report did seem to favor the western Seward-Fairbanks route. The commissioners felt that the western route offered the most effective use of Alaska's coal and agricultural resources. On April 10th, President Wilson announced that the government would build along the western route. He also authorized the purchase of the Alaska Northern Railroad for $1.2 million. Rumors of impending construction brought a stampede of people to Ship Creek. When Lieutenant Mears landed at the base camp in April 1915, he found nearly 2,000 people living in ragged tents and temporary wooden buildings, hoping for employment on the government railroad. The tent city on the banks of Ship Creek lasted only a few weeks. The land along the creek was needed for railroad yards and buildings, and fears of contaminated water in the temporary settlement prompted Mears to establish a permanent town site on the plateau south of Ship Creek. The summer of 1915 saw employment reach about 1,400 workers. A little more than half the workers were independent contractors or station men. They were called station men because the right-of-way was measured in numbered units of 100 feet, and contracts were awarded from station to station. Many station men formed partnerships and hired workers of their own. Throughout the construction of the Alaska Railroad, the workmen endured rugged living conditions, tents without floors, sleeping on pole bunks in honeycomb-like cells, covered with wild hay for mattresses. New arrivals generally had to find a vacant spot or build their own quarters. There was not much money to be made working on the railroad. Early wages paid to unskilled labor was 37.5 cents per hour, considerably lower than the going rate in the territory. A report on wages in the Weekly Alaskan states that at 37.5 cents per hour for outdoor manual labor, at $3 per 8-hour day, a worker would make $468 for 6 months of seasonal work. And then there were the expenses. Boat fare from Seattle to Anchorage and return at $110. 6 months room and board at commission prices, $225. Laundry, clothes, shoes, shaves, haircuts, and baths totaling $68. Thus, after 6 months' work, a common laborer would have net about $64 to last the 6 months when the weather didn't allow construction. It is little wonder that the commission posted a notice in the Seattle steamship offices discouraging outsiders. Those going to Ship Creek, Alaska, with the idea of finding ready employment on the new work will be largely disappointed. But there were workers and work to be done. Mears started clearing right-of-way in May 1916. By September, Anchorage and Seward were linked with telephone and telegraph connections. And by the end of that year, grading had been completed for 35 miles, and right-of-way cleared for 40 miles, and track had been laid for 13 miles. But it was the time of World War I, and in 1916, even though the United States had not yet entered the war, the Commission began to feel its effects. The railroad faced increased ocean freight rates and rising costs for material and labor. But work did progress. On the Northern Division, a pioneer party reached the town site of Nenana and began building a dock, warehouse, and wagon roads. By the end of 1916, almost 800 people were living there. In June of 1917, Secretary of the Interior Frank Lane announced the purchase of the Tanana Valley Railroad, the narrow-gauge line from Fairbanks to Chattanooga. This gave the government a right-of-way into Fairbanks. It added valued shops, stations, yards, and terminal facilities to the Northern Division. By October, the first train reached the coal mines at Chickaloon, 75 miles north of Anchorage. 6 days later, the first shipment of coal returned to Anchorage. Employment peaked at 5,675 for 1917. Though the greater part of the railroad was built on top of tundra-covered ground, there were many miles of heavy rock work, excavation, and tunneling. During the 5-month work season of 1917, over 4 million cubic yards of solid rock were hand-drilled and hand-excavated along the 30-mile shoreline of Turnagain Arm. With the entrance of the United States into World War I, the Commission lost 2 key men. Lieutenant Mears left to accept a promotion to colonel in command of the 31st Engineer Regiment in France. Thomas Riggs resigned to take an appointment as governor of the Alaska Territory. It was left to Chairman Eads to build a railroad with a 50% cut in his workforce, as many Alaska workers left for military service, while others were drawn to higher wages in the lower 48. In spite of the many difficulties during the wartime period, construction continued. By the end of 1918, 230 miles of standard gauge line had been built, with 30 miles of sidings, spurs, and yard tracks finished. Another 53 miles of line had been graded, 30 miles cleared, and steel gangs linked Seward and Anchorage. In August, due to poor health, Chairman Eads resigned. Colonel Mears returned and was placed in charge of the entire project as chairman and chief engineer. During the war and for a time afterward, construction slowed due to a lack of funds caused by inflation. The Commission had to ask Congress for additional money to complete its work. In October of 1919, Congress authorized $17 million. 2 years later, 1921, 2 steel bridges closed gaps in the line. On February 2nd, the American Bridge Company completed the 504-foot span across the Susitna River. And 7 months later, the Hurricane Gulch Bridge arched over the Chulitna River at the midpoint of the line. Most of the spring of 1922 was spent building the approaches for the Tanana Bridge site. This was the most formidable river crossing of the entire railroad and required a 700-foot span. With its completion in February 1923, the Alaska Railroad was almost finished. It was left only to widen the narrow-gauge rails from Nenana north to Fairbanks. Formal dedication of the railroad came on July 15, 1923. President Warren G. Harding, the third president to be involved in the construction, arrived in Nenana by special train to drive the symbolic Golden Spike, signifying the completion of the federal government's Alaska Railroad. From Nenana, the president traveled to Fairbanks, where he addressed most of the town's 1,500 citizens. I do not suppose any individual or set of individuals would have undertaken the construction of such a railway, that it had to be left to the government itself. I am glad a generous government understood and carried to completion the construction of the Alaska Railroad. The Alaska Railroad had taken more than 8 years to complete and cost almost $60 million, more than 7 times the amount the United States paid Russia for Alaska in 1867. The first order of business at the completion of the railroad was to bring the entire line up to reasonable operating standards. Many stretches of original track and structures built in earlier days were near the point of collapse. Many of the wooden ties, trestles, and bridges had been made from short-lived timbers. Tracks needed ballast. Right-of-ways needed improved alignment and grading. In 1928, Colonel Otto Olson was put in charge of the Alaska Railroad, and for the next 17 years, he would be its guiding force. He was a familiar sight out on the line in his Dodge Railmobile. By 1930, the combined population of Seward, Anchorage, and Fairbanks was only 5,400. The population along the route was not large enough to support the operation of the railroad. The annual operating statement of the railroad showed deficit after deficit. Olson cut costs and reorganized the railroad. And in 1938, for the first time since 1923, revenues exceeded expenses. Starting in 1940, the Alaska Railroad set new records each year by carrying construction equipment, material, men, and supplies for the Army. But the increased rail traffic brought rapid deterioration. By October of 1942, Olson was complaining that due to the loss of personnel to the armed forces, it was impossible to perform necessary ballast work or replacement of ties. He had to ask for outside assistance to help transport the military supplies and keep the line operating. On April 3, 1942, the 714th Railroad Operating Battalion was assigned to Alaska. With a complement of 25 officers and 1,090 enlisted men, the 714th eased the railroad's labor shortage. It became commonplace for an engine crew to consist of 1 civilian employee and 1 enlisted man. And for the next 25 months, they worked side by side, keeping the supplies moving. It was also during World War II, in an effort to safeguard the flow of military supplies from Tidewater to Anchorage and Fairbanks, that a branch called the Whittier Cutoff was constructed under the supervision of the Army Engineer Corps. The main line was extended from Whittier on Prince William Sound to Portage Station. Completed in the spring of 1943, the new line was 12 miles long and included 2 tunnels through the mountains. Construction gave the railroad 2 terminal ports, Seward and Whittier, where connections could be made with ocean steamships. In 1945, at the age of 75, Otto Olson retired. Colonel J.P. Johnson was appointed general manager. The railroad was still in need of extensive repair and rebuilding, and Johnson's first action was an appeal to Congress for funding of major rehabilitation. Congress passed $34 million in appropriations for rebuilding and the purchase of new equipment. Johnson began improvements by eliminating dangerous curves, replacing wooden bridges with steel structures, and replacing 70-pound steel rails with 115-pound rails. He coupled this program with the modernizing and improving of warehouses, shop facilities, freight depots, and other buildings. In 1947, the railroad streamlined passenger travel for tourists. The railroad's new passenger train, the Aurora, made its inaugural run on October 18th between Anchorage and Fairbanks. By the early 1950s, the adventure of the steam engine had given way to the economic realities of the diesel. Change also included competition. A burgeoning highway trucking industry brought losses in revenues to the railroad. But other industry reacted with a containerization program pioneered by the Alaska Steamship Company, and a move into piggyback shipping helped the railroad to again compete and regain lost revenues. Alaskans and the railroad will long remember March 27, 1964, as the Good Friday earthquake. About $27 million in damage was caused to the railroad in those few minutes that the earth shook. In spite of the damage, the line from Anchorage to Fairbanks was operational within days, and the line from Whittier to Anchorage was opened a little over 3 weeks after the quake. Between 1974 and 1977, during the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the railroad prospered, hauling tons of pipe and other oil field supplies and equipment. The railroad emerged from this period of heavy usage in better physical condition than it was at the beginning of the period. In January 1985, under the Alaska Railroad Transfer Act, the federal government sold the railroad to the state of Alaska for $22.3 million. The Alaska legislature created the Alaska Railroad Corporation to operate the railroad and manage its properties. A unique aspect of the Alaska Railroad is the rural or bush service. It moves people and their belongings to remote areas not served by highway or air. It's one of the few railroads left in the world where rural passengers can still flag down a train at almost any point for personal service. The railroad also provides a unique service to Whittier by transporting not only foot passengers, but riders in automobiles and buses. In the late 1980s, with the growing number of port calls by cruise ships, the general increase in tourism and the marketing of train trips as part of package tours, railroad passenger service has greatly increased. Today, both freight and passenger service are available year-round between Anchorage and Fairbanks and Anchorage and Whittier, with summer service offered between Anchorage and Seward. Hard work and the dedication of thousands of men and women of the Alaska Railroad opened up the last frontier and helped to develop Alaska into the country that it is today.
Production funding for this program made possible in part by a grant from the Anchorage Times, celebrating 75 years of service to Alaskans.